They were convinced, absolutely convinced, that their tanks were invincible. The Type 95 Ha-Go light tank had proven itself beyond doubt. It crushed Chinese forces. It held its own against some Soviet armor at Khalkhin-Gol. And in the sweeping victories across Malaya and the Philippines in the early days of the war, the Ha-Go advanced through terrain British commanders thought impossible for armor. To the Japanese tank crews, this light tank represented the pinnacle of armored warfare design. It was perfectly suited for the jungles and islands of the Pacific. They had crushed every enemy they encountered. They were wrong. The birth of false confidence, the Ha-Go's design story. The story of how they discovered this fatal error begins not with defeat, but with confidence born from years of success. The Ha-Go was no accident of design. It was the product of careful military planning that began in 1933. The Imperial Japanese Army needed speed. Their older workhorse, the Type 89, could only manage 15 miles per hour. That was adequate for infantry support, but utterly inadequate for the mechanized warfare they envisioned. They wanted a tank that could keep up with motorized infantry, navigate the terrain of Manchuria, and most importantly, one that their industrial base could produce in quantity. The specifications were clear. Weight, approximately 7 tons. Main gun, 37 millimeters. Speed, 40 kilometers per hour. Armor, sufficient to resist rifle and machine gun fire. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries received the contract. When the first prototype was completed in 1934, it impressed military observers. It was fast and incredibly maneuverable. The distinctive bell-crank suspension system absorbed shocks well, allowing the tank to traverse rough terrain that would have stopped other vehicles. The tank ran on a 6-cylinder diesel engine, a point of pride for Japanese engineers, making it less vulnerable to fire than gasoline-powered vehicles. The fatal flaw: the numbers don't lie. But at a meeting in 1935 to formally adopt the design, the first cracks appeared. Infantry representatives worried. Was 12 millimeters of armor sufficient? Cavalry representatives countered that improved speed and mobility compensated for the thin armor, and the Type 95 Ha-Go was officially adopted. The tank was small, just under 4.4 meters long, and it weighed 7.4 tons. Its armor, however, was thin by any standard. 12 millimeters was the maximum thickness on the turret and upper hull, 9 millimeters on the roof and floor. The designers assumed this armor would stop rifle and machine gun bullets at combat ranges. They were designing for the enemies they expected to fight. Inside, it was worse. A cramped 3-man crew. The driver, the hull machine gunner, and the commander. The commander stood alone in the turret, tasked with commanding, aiming, loading, and firing the 37-millimeter main gun, plus operating a secondary machine gun in the rear. There was barely room to move, let alone fight efficiently. Yet in China and Malaya, the Ha-Go performed as exactly designed. It was devastating. But this success bred a dangerous assumption that the Ha-Go was a genuinely capable tank, rather than a vehicle optimized for a very limited scenario. That assumption would die in the Mariana Islands. The calm before the storm, hubris in the Pacific. Japanese confidence was only briefly shaken. In 1939, the Ha-Go faced a real challenge at Khalkhin-Gol on the Mongolian border against the Soviet Union. Here, the Ha-Go encountered Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks, which mounted 45mm guns with better armor penetration. Soviet armor was thicker, making frontal engagements difficult for the Japanese tank. The battles were brutal. By the end of the campaign, Japan had lost dozens of tanks. The lessons were clear. The Hago was outmatched by modern armor. Its thin protection and relatively weak gun were not adequate. But Japanese leadership did not fully absorb these lessons, focusing instead on tactics and crew training. The war in China continued, and there the Hago remained effective. When war broke out across the Pacific in December 1941, Japanese tank units achieved remarkable successes. In the Philippines, Hagos engaged American M3 Stuart light tanks in the first tank-versus-tank battle involving U.S. forces in the Pacific. Despite the M3's superior armor, the Japanese achieved some success. These early victories reinforced Japanese confidence. From their perspective, the Hago was performing exactly as designed, mobile, reliable, and effective in supporting infantry. They trusted their machines. The Anvil and the Hammer, Saipan, June 1944. But Saipan was different. The island in the Mariana Chain was strategically vital, just 1,250 miles from Tokyo. If the Americans captured Saipan, B-29 bombers would be within range of the Japanese home islands. On Saipan, the 9th Tank Regiment, commanded by Colonel Takashi Guto, waited. The regiment was equipped with 44 tanks, a mixture of Hagos and the slightly larger Type 97 Chi-Ha. This was the largest armored force the Americans had yet faced in the Pacific. On June 15, 1944, the Americans began their assault. Marines from the 2nd and 4th Divisions landed on the western beaches under heavy fire. By nightfall, 20,000 American troops were ashore. Among the equipment landing were the M4 Sherman medium tanks. Japanese General Yoshitsugu Saito realized the critical situation. He issued orders for a major counterattack, a coordinated night assault by infantry and armor. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 17, 1944, Colonel Guto's tanks moved out. 44 tanks, the roar of their diesel engines and the clanking of their tracks echoed in the gloom. The Japanese crews were confident, advancing toward the positions of the 2nd Marine Division. But the Americans heard them coming. The moment of revelation, the .50 caliber heavy machine gun. As the Hagos charged toward the American lines, Marine riflemen and machine gunners opened fire. These were not the standard 30 caliber or 7.62 millimeter infantry machine guns. These were the .50 caliber or 12.7 millimeter Browning M2 heavy machine guns. The M2 was a formidable weapon designed to engage aircraft and light vehicles. Its standard ammunition included armor-penetrating, or AP, rounds. The mathematics of armor penetration are unforgiving. The .50 caliber AP rounds could penetrate 23 millimeters of face-hardened steel at 200 meters. The maximum thickness of the Hago's armor? 12 millimeters. When the Marine gunners opened fire, something happened that neither side expected. The .50 caliber rounds didn't just dent the armor. They didn't ricochet. They penetrated cleanly, decisively. At close range, some armor-penetrating rounds went completely through the tank, entering one side and exiting the other. Even at longer ranges, the rounds punched through the thin Japanese armor with energy to spare. Inside the cramped Japanese tanks, it was worse than defeat. It was a shattering revelation. Heavy machine gun fire was penetrating the armor, striking the engine components, shattering the ammunition racks, and killing the crew. One captured Japanese tank officer later told American interrogators that his first thought was that the Americans must have developed some new secret weapon firing exotic projectiles. He simply could not accept that a conventional heavy machine gun could defeat his tank. The Hago myth was dying. The inevitable conclusion: the Sherman arrives. As the Japanese tank attack faltered under this unexpected fire, American M4 Sherman tanks moved forward to engage. The contrast was stark. Hago, 7.4 tons, 12 millimeters of armor. Sherman M4A2, 31.8 tons and 51 millimeters of sloped frontal armor. The Sherman's 75 millimeter gun could penetrate the Hago's armor from over a mile away. When the Shermans opened fire, the outcome was predetermined. The 75 millimeter round struck the Japanese tanks with devastating effect, blowing turrets off hulls. When the Japanese tanks attempted to return fire, their 37 millimeter and 57 millimeter shells bounced harmlessly off the Sherman's frontal armor. By mid-morning on June 17, 1944, the Japanese counterattack was over. 31 to 35 destroyed Japanese tanks littered the battlefield. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, including many tank crews, were dead. The attack had been stopped, but the truth that emerged for the Marines walking among the wreckage was more significant. The Japanese tank was not a serious threat. It was just another target. The psychological impact on the surviving Japanese crews was profound. They felt betrayed. Their tanks, which they had trusted with their lives, offered no protection against weapons the Americans used as standard infantry support. These reports changed Marine tactics. The fear that came with facing Japanese armor evaporated. While Japan struggled with resource shortages and industrial inability to produce modern tanks like the Type 3 Chi-Nu, the United States was launching more Sherman tanks from single factories like the Detroit Tank Arsenal in 1 month than Japan produced in an entire year. The Battle of Saipan was the turning point for Japanese armor. It was the end of the era where fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage. A single .50 caliber round proved what years of fighting could not, that the Hago legend was over, and that modern warfare required steel, not just will. The final section, deepening the psychological and strategic impact. The Marines, examining the Hago wreckage after the battle, didn't just see a destroyed machine, they saw physical evidence of vulnerability. The Marine officer pointing to the holes knew this discovery would change how they fought forever. The clean, definitive penetrations, bullets entering one side and exiting the other, were irrefutable proof. The danger they had feared was never actually there. The psychological fallout from this discovery was as important as the tactical one. The dread of Japanese armor that had prevailed in early Guadalcanal evaporated. Marines no longer saw Japanese tanks as monsters requiring bazookas or heavy artillery. They became simply light vehicles to be removed with standard infantry weapons. Betrayal and the impossible explanation. For the surviving Japanese tank crews, it was a matter of technological betrayal. In intelligence interrogations, the answers were disturbingly consistent. The Japanese soldiers could not comprehend how a thumb-sized round could penetrate the very machine that was promised to protect their lives. Some insisted the Americans must possess rounds with a core of uranium, tungsten, or some kind of secret magical material. This impossible explanation was easier to accept than the truth, that their country's design was fundamentally obsolete and inadequate. One tank commander told an intelligence officer, "We believed the Japanese fighting spirit superseded American technology, but when enemy machine gun fire penetrates your armor, spirit cannot stop the fragments." These conclusions, confirming that willpower could not defeat American steel production, influenced every subsequent Japanese strategic decision, including abandoning costly beach defenses and shifting to defense-in-depth tactics. The industrial verdict, a fate decided by factories, Saipan proved one thing conclusively. This was an industrial war, and the United States was winning it on an unimaginable scale. It wasn't that the Japanese didn't know how to design better tanks. They designed tanks like the Type 4 Chi-To, which was comparable in armament and armor to Allied medium tanks. But these tanks existed only on paper, or as minuscule prototypes. The Japanese priority was aircraft, specifically for kamikaze formations, and heavy coastal artillery to meet the anticipated invasion of the home islands. Tanks, after the humiliating defeat at Saipan, were at the very bottom of the priority list. Conversely, the American numbers spoke with brutal clarity. 97 Sherman tanks in 1 month from one factory. This overwhelming mass production not only provided crushing superiority in quality, the Sherman was 4 times the weight and over 4 times the frontal armor thickness of the Ha-Go, but it also guaranteed a constant abundance of resources. For the remaining Japanese forces across the islands, the message was stark and final. The tanks they had were all they would ever get. There would be no replacement. There would be no upgrade. Thus, the Battle of June 17, 1944 at Saipan became more than just an armored clash. It was a moment of judgment. It was the standard infantry weapon, the Browning M2 50-caliber machine gun, that delivered the final verdict on the brief golden age of the Japanese Ha-Go light tank. And that single realization became the foundation upon which subsequent Marine victories in the Pacific were built. In the end, the battle for Saipan was more than just a tactical victory. It was a brutal correction of reality. It proved that courage cannot be armor against the industrial war machine. The story of the Ha-Go is a stark reminder of how technological superiority ultimately writes the final chapter in conflict. Its end was shocking, an execution sentence delivered by the standard infantry weapon of the U.S. military. If this incredible story of how a single-caliber round shifted the balance of power in the Pacific captured your interest, let us keep uncovering these forgotten narratives. Don't let history stop here. Hit that like button if you learned something new today, and let us know in the comments, were you shocked that the 50 caliber was so effective against the tank? And most importantly, subscribe to WW2 Era Stories now and ring that bell. We promise to keep bringing you World War II stories you've never heard before right to your screen. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.